there's something that I find that we often lack, and that is context. Because what's going on in the world today is a terrible thing, the restrictions on freedom, the censorship, but it is not new. The first thing that people say is, oh, I don't believe in conspiracies. If you can show them, actually, there are so many effectively proven and sometimes completely proven conspiracies, it puts you in a stronger position because what the comeback is generally, go on then, mate, prove it. Well, actually, we're going to see today there's always been conspiracies, there's always been conspiracy theorists, and more to the point, we have never trusted authority. And we're going to see there's a repeating pattern of that, and they've always tried to suppress people. So you all know this symbol. And it's something that everybody shows, but not everybody knows the context. So this is called the Eye of Providence. It is a Masonic symbol created in 1776, and it represents the divine being at the top, that's the eye, and that was often used to represent the divine being in many ancient paintings, and then it kind of got subverted. And the pyramid, actually, the 13 layers, represent the 13 original states of the United States of America. That's actually what the pyramid represents. And of course, then you've got references to world order underneath in Latin. So this often gets sort of promoted as the all-seeing eye, it is a symbol of domination, which you could argue in a way that it is. There at the top, we are trapped in the pyramid below. But, and here's the clincher, of course, most people don't know they're trapped in the pyramid because they never get to see it from the outside. And that's an important point. It's that many people, and I'd like to hope most of us here have broken out of that, but many people have not ever stepped outside of it to see that they're even in the pyramid with a dominating force above. So in a way, that symbol, it sort of represents the essence of conspiracy theory, the belief that somebody at the top lords it over those of us at the bottom, and we're left never really knowing what's going on. Which is why, if you would go onto the internet today and just pick any story you want, as you all know, you're going to find 1,000 conspiracy versions giving you a different view of it, saying we believe that there is another story here that we are not allowed to tell. And of course, at the moment, the instinct of the powers that be is to put the lid on, is to suppress, to censor. And of course, that's what we're very much up against now. I mean, one of the interesting things is when you look at the academic view of conspiracy theories, and they're getting quite good at doing this now, is to basically say that we are one of two things. If we question orthodoxy, we are either, right, trouble. We're troubled minds and we're causing trouble, and what we're doing basically is spreading fear through our mental illness. So that's one side, that we're all effectively mentally ill. And the other thing is to ridicule. And that's an old policy, is to say that, well, don't take these people seriously, they're just having a laugh. That's changed more now. And of course, after the pandemic, there was a huge change because suddenly they realised they weren't having a laugh, and we genuinely are concerned with the way the world is going, and that we're not allowed to say that anymore. I mean, a conspiracy believer, let's call ourselves that, we are really, would say that we're critical thinkers. And that's another way of looking at it. And what, of course, is so extraordinary is there are so many people in the world that actually do believe in conspiracies. If you look at the polls as to what people believe, belief in it is going up and up and up. So what's wrong there with that picture? And yet, if you listen to the BBC, which we all love, of course, you would be led to believe that they're all mad and that, they're all very naughty people for believing that. And anyway, it's only a few fringe people that believe it. Well, it isn't. And that, of course, is one of the reasons they have to keep putting the lid on it, because they know it's not fringe and they know it is growing. So let's go back in time a bit, because I want to kind of talk about, the patterns throughout history. If you've never read Roman history, I really recommend you do. I'm currently ploughing through the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, a Roman writer at the time, and it's fantastic. And you'll find everything going on now in there. Deception, public doubt in authority, assassination attempts, conspiracies. This was normal. And everybody knew that you could not trust the authorities. It was accepted that you couldn't, but you had to just kind of get on with it. And in a way, that is still where we are at today. But this image, this is a very familiar image. Here we see the Emperor Nero. And we always see him playing music while Rome is on fire. And that's because, of course, he was widely accused at the time of causing the fire. So this was a kind of a false flag attack in the eyes of many. And we'll talk about the origins of that term in a moment, because that's very important. So he was accused of starting it. He'd long wanted to build Rome in his own way and thus take more social control. Because if you can build a city in a certain way, it actually gives you a lot more dominance. And he didn't like the way it was made. So when it burned down, as it did in 64 AD, that was very convenient. And he was then able to build the Rome that he wanted and thus assume even more control. But many people thought, you know what, he gave the orders to do this, didn't he? And the people that he blamed at the time were the early Christians. So they were blamed for starting the fire. So, hey, nothing changes, does it? So the Great Fire of Rome is just one instance where we see power probably up to no good, and most people believing that, but the time goes by and you're never quite sure, and everybody shrugs and says, oh well. And that is a dangerous shrug, and it is a shrug that we still see people doing today. Even when dastardly deeds are clearly exposed, everyone goes, oh well. And of course, by allowing that, it never gets addressed, and that's a very dangerous way to be. So what about the origin of false flag? We all use this, even now the news, especially to do with Ukraine, you might have noticed this, openly uses this phrase, that was false flag, normally blaming Putin, of course. So if you actually don't know what it means, it's just worth understanding where this comes from. So it comes from the Roman times and other civilizations too, where they do this neat trick of either dressing their ships up in the colours and style of the enemy, or literally hijacking ships of the enemy and then using those ships to attack their own fleet, hence, of course, false flag. So this kind of goes back an awfully long way. And it's worth a quick look at the Roman Empire. So we see that today, and there's the empire at its height, and we see really a Mediterranean empire with a few extra bits bolted on. But in its time, that was a world empire. That was the world that they knew. And the Romans were very good at putting a lot of power into very few hands. And that was one thing you can't knock them for. You might not like it, but they did it very well. In the end, it all fell apart, of course, as most empires do. But it left a legacy of a lot of powerful people thinking, you know what, we'd quite like to have a go at that. And there were various attempts to set up different empires over the years. And of course, we didn't have a bad old go, did we? There you go, look. The British Empire, all those pink bits. Now, the thing about the British Empire is, of course, today there's a lot of guilt and shame and arguing over it. But anyway, there it was. It really, to be honest with you, began as much as anything as a trade protection empire. I don't think it was initially the idea to rule the world, but then it kind of was like, well, while we're at it, I suppose we might as well. But it wouldn't last either. And in the crumbling away of this would become something that we all know and love, and that is called the New World Order. And most of you here probably know this, but just in case you don't, that isn't some kind of nickname used in the conspiracy world. It is a real traceable project that's been on the go for a very long time. And we're going to trace really today, the path of the New World Order, because that is intertwined with belief in conspiracy theory. And the origins of the New World Order really lie, therefore, in the origins of the British Empire. So in the Elizabethan times, we'd just come out of the whole Protestant Reformation beginning. Henry VIII had split us away from the rule of Catholic Rome, of course. And that would cause an awful lot of upset for quite a long time. Elizabeth came and she stabilised us as a Protestant nation. So she basically said, look, I don't even know what's in your hearts, just follow the rules and we'll all be all right. Although that said, she did execute an awful lot of people. But anyway, that meant that Catholics were being oppressed in effect. And I mean, if you were quietly Catholic, you'd be fine probably. If you were overtly Catholic, you might wind up on the scaffold. And of course, what that did was set up this belief that most things that went wrong in society was probably down to Catholics. So today they blame conspiracy theorists. Back then, a conspiracy theorist and a Catholic were seen as one and the same thing. And this really matters because, of course, when Elizabeth died, and James the First took the throne. There was a hope. Right, James is going to be different. His mother was a Catholic, Mary Queen of Scots. This is going to be different. He's bound to emancipate the Catholics, said the Catholics. And then, of course, when it became clear he wasn't going to, and wasn't going to rock the boat, that upset a lot of Catholics, leading to a whole spate of conspiracies and attempted assassination plots. And, of course, their most famous one is the Gunpowder Plot. But there's a whole other side to the Gunpowder Plot that many people don't seem to know. If anybody saw me speaking on the Iconic channel last November, you will have heard me raising this, and I was astonished how few people knew this next bit. So we all know the official story. So a man called Robert Catesby led this attempt to blow up the king and the parliament on the 5th of November 1605. They basically packed the Undercroft underneath the old House of Lords, not the buildings we see today, and we're going to just blow up everyone in one go. And the point there was that that would then initiate hopefully, a foreign invasion by Catholic powers, and B, a mass Catholic uprising that would restore their power. It didn't work. One of them, still argued about who, warned one of the barons not to go into Parliament that day. This letter was sent, right, and some say a man called Francis Tresham sent it, but other people think it's actually far more nefarious than that. So right at the last minute, the game was given away. And they searched the cellars, and that's where they found Guido Fawkes, or Guy Fawkes. That's why he's the one we all remember, rather than Robert Catesby, because Fawkes was the one caught red-handed. Who sent that letter? This letter is crucial, because clearly somebody, if you say it wasn't one of the plotters, and the evidence is looking more and more like it probably wasn't, somebody within government already knew this plot was up and running and allowed it nearly to come to fruition and stopped it at the last minute, probably with the aim of discrediting the Catholics even further. And I mean, here's a picture of a Jesuit priest called John Gerard. So Jesuits were like very extreme Catholics and thus very unpopular in England at this time. You can see him there being tortured in the Tower of London. Incredibly, after 3 days of that, he escaped. Somebody must have helped him. And again, this tells you something, that underneath what we're told was another story going on. When he got to France, he wrote an account of the Gunpowder Plot. He had known some of the plotters. He wasn't involved, and he also said he didn't even approve of it. And actually, many Catholics didn't, because had it succeeded, it probably actually would have just seen even more persecution of the Catholics. And to a degree, this happened even just with the exposure of the plot. But it's worth reading, right, his account of the Gunpowder Plot. And he clearly says, without using the word, this was false flag. Right, so I'll give you a quote. He said, the government of the day either found means to instigate the conspirators to undertake their enterprise, or at least being, from an early stage, fully aware of what was going on, sedulously nursed the insane scheme till the time came to make capital out of it. So in other words, he's saying this was false flag. The Protestant government, they either initiated it or more likely got wind that it was happening and thought, hey, you know what, let's help this along a bit and we'll catch him in the act. And it worked. And it discredited the Catholics even further. And what that meant was, by the time we got to 1666 and they got to the Great Fire of London, around which there are many conspiracies, even to this day, as to who did it and why, nonetheless, many people believed this was a Catholic arson plot, because we'd come out of very difficult times, right? We'd just come out of the English Civil Wars, and many had blamed them on Catholic influence on Charles I. Now, anything that went wrong must be Catholics, right? You want to blame somebody, blame a Catholic. And certainly Charles had strong Catholic leanings. So that all ended horrifically, of course. Long civil war, terrible bloodshed. Charles wound up with his head being chopped off, and we then wound up living for a short while, at least, under a bleak Puritan republic. So many thought, yeah, the Fire of London, okay, what this is, the Catholics getting their own back, they're making a point. And that was widely believed, and so people went around persecuting the Catholics even more for having caused the Fire of London. And into this world of extreme suspicion strides a man called Titus Oates. Now go and look up Titus Oates, fascinating character. He didn't help us, okay? He was a Jesuit priest at some point himself. He'd then been disgraced and then thrown out of the order. And that meant he now had a very big chip on his shoulder about Catholics in general. And suddenly, whereas he was one of them, now he wanted to get his own back. So he strode into London knowing that anything he said against Catholics would be believed, and said there is a new popish plot to kill the new king, Charles II. So by now we'd re-established the monarchy. Having got rid of it, we then went back to it. So he said, right, the Pope's going to have him murdered, and if you don't want this to happen, you need to give me men and money, and I'll stop this happening for you. And he was believed. So he went round with a whole platoon of men, arresting people. Around 30 people were executed purely on the say-so of oaths. Problem is, and this is where it doesn't help us, he made it all up. It soon became clear that he was actually just lying. And as the years went by and his claims got ever wilder, and then he started paying witnesses who then said, I was paid, I didn't really see that, the game was up. And so, of course, Oates then wound up in the pillory, and by association, anybody that believed in conspiracies from that point on would be seen as a social pariah. And this has never really gone away. It wouldn't stop belief in conspiracies, as we can see, but it would mean that it was no longer respectable. And we should know, people had died during this, so there were many reasons why it was suddenly seen as a dangerous route to go down. And that is a taint that has lasted for a long time. And of course, you can name many other people like this since, who don't help. So one lesson here is, if we're going to claim that there are, conspiracies, and we're going to claim that there is suppression, we need to know our facts and be absolutely sure that we're as right as we can be, Nothing wrong sometimes with speculating if you have to. So this is something worth bearing in mind. But it didn't mean conspiracies went away. Indeed, in 1776, two important things happened. One, you get the foundation of the Illuminati. They did exist. Now, does that have anything to do with what's going on now? You're going to have to make your own minds up on that. But there was an original Illuminati. It was a Bavarian secret order. Here are some of the founding members there. And it was a kind of a wheeze to begin with. It was like, hey, Kate, wouldn't it be great to have power without legitimately having to get it? We just sort of manipulate people from behind the curtain, which they did through extortion or just kind of paying the right people. And it made them very powerful for a brief time, but it didn't last. It was exposed within 10 years, and the Illuminati were actually disbanded. But of course, many people believe that what was left of the Illuminati ideals, if not any of the original people themselves, then got seeded around the world. Especially and of course the same year, in the United States of America, because we know secret societies are very, very powerful there, as they are here, and of course across the West and probably around the world, but especially in America, and we all know about, Kappa Phi Beta and, all the Yale University secret orders that basically decide who your president's going to be next time. They do exist, and they're very powerful, and not enough people talk about them. But, even if the name Illuminati was never used again, that notion of ruled by secrecy, it had been shown it could actually work a bit, and if we don't get found out next time, maybe it's worth keeping this going. So they wouldn't necessarily sit there at a desk and think that, but in essence, that is where it led. And then, of course, people would get wind of the fact that maybe there was a power below what we normally see. And that would then lead to a belief that there was this plot that basically is what most of us here believe today, to rule the world without telling us how and why they're doing it. And whether you want to think it's a satanic plot or just human beings wanting power, I'll leave that up to you. But it was something that would go on a while. Arthur Balfour, in 1909, who was just about to become one of our famous prime ministers, could see that the writing was on the wall for the British Empire. At this stage, the empire was crumbling away, the beginnings of it. And he thought, I don't want to go down with this ship. So he came up with this brilliant idea of working with America to keep us strong on the world stage. He could see that America, now led by Teddy Roosevelt, who you can see there, was the up-and-coming superpower. And that if we wanted to stay at the top of the game, we'd have to work with them. So thus, there's much more to the special relationship than some people may know. So he basically wrote to Roosevelt and said, look, I got an idea, right? You need us, we need you, though. We've got some very powerful navies. Let's rule the world using our navies because all the rest are foreigners. And basically, that was the attitude. And then people like Cecil Rhodes got involved, and the Round Table, not much to do with the current Round Table, but the original Round Table. Look them up. Look up the works of Terry Boardman on the New World Order, by the way, and you get to the detail of this. And this was a very overt plot, and it's all in the record, right? It's not somebody making this up. You can read the letters. And they're pretty damning, basically saying, using Western hegemony, we're going to run the world, and we don't want the other lot to. Now, China and Russia probably got their own ideas, right? Some say they all secretly work together. That's argued about. I don't know. But certainly the New World Order that Rhodes and Balfour had in mind was about Western power. So let's be clear about that. And so this then took on a name, and it became known as the New World Order. So don't let anybody ever tell you this doesn't exist. It does, and we know people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Obama have openly boasted in speeches of the need to create the New World Order. But even in the early 1900s, leading thinkers like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, they were very loud advocates for the New World Order. Wells even wrote a book called The New World Order, and it wasn't fiction. It was a non-fiction blueprint. And you can read it for free online, by the way. I recommend you do. And you read it and you go, oh yeah, they followed that, didn't they? And this was seen by them as a good idea. They thought this was a very positive way forward for the world. However, dark seeds were embedded here because, for instance, both of them advocated eugenics, or what today they call negative eugenics, which is not quite so fashionable these days. So this is where then you get this tier of power building up, and it takes on more genuine powers and more influence, and we'll see a bit later, occult influence begins to creep in, and this starts to become a thing that you're not supposed to talk about, even if you notice it. But a few people had a go. Shortly before he became a president, Woodrow Wilson wrote a book in 1913 called The New Freedom. And in this book, he seemed to actually be trying to warn people what was going on. And he was quite brave. And here's a brief quote from the book. He said, "Some of the biggest men in the United States are afraid. They know that there is a power somewhere, so organized, so subtle, so watchful, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." So he's being really bold there. We all know there's a bunch of people you don't want to annoy if you want to get on. But that then changed, because when Wilson became president, suddenly he forgot that he'd ever said that, and instead went on to do things like found the Federal Reserve. We've already been talking about money today, so I'm not going to go over all that again, but listen, of course, money matters. The Federal Reserve is still seen by many, not just conspiracy theorists, as a widely corrupt scheme that corralled public money in a way that should never have occurred. And even today, some people try to take court cases out against it to try to shut it down. It's kind of like the American version of the Bank of England, if you want a very brief and silly explanation, but it gives you the idea. But that would come into play later on, as we shall see, with another rather famous American president. It goes without saying, right, that we could continue the rest of the day talking about money and banking and various conspiracies. Most of you know this already. Let's just say this for today, though. That, of course, all the time those at the tops of the glass towers have the means and the money to put many things right tomorrow, but choose not to and serve themselves instead. Well, funnily enough, you're going to get conspiracy theories, which they don't seem to like. And naturally enough, money is power. the corporations, the massive lobbying power. It's easy in the conspiracy world to overlook this like it doesn't matter. It does matter. This is where the New World Order gets its teeth in, because we often find some people say, oh, that's conspiracy theory and I'm interested in that. That's just news. No, it isn't. It's all one and the same. And the people we elect to Parliament, by the way, often go on to become leading New World Order lights, like Tony Blair, classic example. And people still in power today, like Michael Gove, are regular attenders of the Bilderberg. So don't say that what goes on in normal politics doesn't matter. It does. And that's also true for the economy. And of course, yeah, there's layers we don't see, but in the end, it all meets in the middle. But controlling the economy may not be enough to control the whole world, right? You want to control the world? You might need to manipulate events as well. And wartime often offers opportunities for this. One of the conspiracy theories of World War I that is oft discussed and generally dismissed by the mainstream, but I'm not sure why, is to do with this vessel here. This is the Lusitania. So in 1915, of course, we were now in World War I. America was trying to stay out. But this vessel was one of ours, going back and forth across the Atlantic at a time that was very dangerous. German U-boats were everywhere. You had to protect yourselves. And whenever Lusitania, which of course would often have Americans on board, whenever it got into British waters, we would send out warship escorts to see it safely into harbour. Well, that was normal until one day the warship suddenly just sailed away. No explanation, no message. Nobody knows to this day why they suddenly left Lusitania vulnerable. And of course, therefore, within hours, the ship was torpedoed and down it went. And over 1,200 people died in this atrocity. And this had a profound effect because, of course, many Americans had now been lost. And America, that was basically not really wanting to get involved with the war, thought, oh, hang on, it's affecting us. That wasn't the thing that led them into the war, but it was a stepping stone towards it. And there were others where suddenly it's made to matter in America, and they're losing people. And then, of course, you ask, well, who would have even given the order to leave that ship vulnerable? Why did they do that? And who gave the order? Well, surely it must have come from the First Lord of the Admiralty. But of course, at this stage in history, the First Lord of the Admiralty is Winston Churchill. Now, look, I'm sure here is over suspicion. Many people still think he's a very wonderful bloke, and he did some good things, but of course others eye him as a key New World Order operative who was very ruthless and might do maybe what he saw as necessary rather than what was morally right. Maybe you sometimes have to do that in wartime, but there's a lot more to Lusitania that we haven't got time for today. Some say it was shipping arms on the quiet and all of this. But here's the thing, you cannot get round the fact that just before the ship went down, he wrote this letter to the Chancellor, saying, it is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany, which of course really we needed. And he then adds, just in case you needed to hear it, and if some of it gets into trouble, better still. So he's saying we need a ship to go down, it'll have great propaganda value. Oh, isn't it funny, I've actually got the power to leave a ship to be vulnerable. Make your own minds up. But you can't get round the fact that after the sinking, posters like this with the mother and the baby drowning from the Lusitania, and that simple word enlist, these had great power. And look around you today and see the same techniques are still being used in whatever the latest atrocity is. So stuff like this works, and people in power know this. But what's really interesting, though, is right when the enemy does it, we're all happy to believe that they do. The burning of the Reichstag Parliament in 1933 changed history because many people don't realise that at this stage, the Nazis were not in full power. There were a lot of communists holding seats in the German parliament. And what that meant was that, of course, the Nazis were always having their hands tied. Now, that changed when one night the Berlin Reichstag Parliament was found to be ablaze, and the Nazis quickly blamed the communists for starting the fire. There was one bloke probably set up, there probably was involved that was a communist, but that enabled them to say, ha, there you go, see? This was the communists. And after the fire, the communists were thus expelled, and, well, you know the rest of history. And then the Nazis rose to their full power. But most Western scholars will tell you today, yeah, but that was a Nazi false flag operation, which, by the way, it probably was. But when you say, well, yeah, okay, fair enough, but then why do you say it never happens like over here as well? And then they go, oh no, we wouldn't do that because we're nice and they were nasty. And I'm afraid that is very much the attitude, but as we know, it doesn't really wash. Right, another war, another conspiracy theory. And the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, again, is a key moment in history. So we're told the US fleet was bombed at Pearl Harbor out of nowhere by the Japanese with no warning, with no provocation. Well, that's not true. So we should note here the US was blockading Japanese oil. It was doing all kinds of things to the Japanese that were going to guarantee a response. And what I find extraordinary is nobody remembers that just a few days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that we're told came as a complete surprise, you could have read about it in the local press in Hawaii. You can't read that. Japan may strike over the weekend. Why did everybody act surprised then when it happened? They knew it was coming. It's pretty clear when you look at the work of even naval historians that warnings were given. They knew when it was going to happen, they knew where and how. But Franklin Roosevelt, cousin to Teddy, who we met earlier on, he wanted America to join the war. So once again, America was trying to stay out. A lot of American businessmen had a lot of money invested in Germany. They didn't want a war. But of course then, once the Japanese attacked, that's how America got drawn in. And again, you know the rest. And before anybody says, well, and we won't hear, but a lot of people on the outside do, well, this is just a modern conspiracy theory. Well, no, it isn't. Because even at the time, top US naval brass like Vice Admiral Libby went on record as saying, I will go to my grave convinced that FDR, Roosevelt, ordered Pearl Harbor to let happen. He must have known. So you're going to find things like this in history all the time, where it's pretty obviously a setup. But if you dare point it out, and you're not a naval historian, you're just a conspiracy theorist. And this is the problem that we have. So then, right near the end of World War II, you get this really interesting moment where at the Yalta Conference in Crimea, which has often been a flashpoint in world history, by the way, you get this meeting of, here we see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, not a very nice man, but he was stupid enough and nasty enough to allow himself at this stage to be set up as the new big enemy. At this stage, they were in alliance, but it wouldn't be long before the Cold War would give the New World Order all the footholds it wanted around the world. This is, of course, something that Orwell wrote about. I mean, if you've never read George Orwell, right, why not? I'm sure many of you here have, but I really recommend go and read 1984, right? It's all in there. And he says you've got to have an enemy out there because it deflects from problems at home, it keeps the arms industry bubbling along, and again, it gives you a foothold in countries you couldn't justify without having that enemy there. And I have to say, Stalin played the role well, and so began the Cold War and everything that followed. And of course, many would argue here we are today, back in the same situation. The new Cold War, or if that's not what it is, I don't know what it is. So there's a lot of people that benefit from this, not least, arms manufacturers and the big money people. The Cold War served a purpose, and of course it served the New World Order. And what's going on now probably serves the people in power today. And that's the problem, and you're never, ever given the full picture. But what I find very interesting is that you'll often be told that the Vietnam War, which of course was a key Cold War, conflict, began with what was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, there's many kind of maritime conspiracies, and they're just good ones to use to show just how obvious lies do get told when it comes to war. So we are told that the US fleet, similar to Pearl Harbor, one night got attacked very, very heavily by North Vietnamese communist forces. And the attack was so terrible that it left the Americans with no choice but to go to war. Well, that's the official story. Actually, the real story is rather different. Let's have a look at the real Gulf of Tonkin incident. There's a couple of snaps here, so you can see actually it was a minor gunboat skirmish. That was normal in those waters. That happened basically every other day in the Gulf of Tonkin. So why are we told that a huge attack occurred? Well, what we should say is this. What really happened, it turns out, was one night a very heavy fog came down in the Gulf of Tonkin, and nobody could see visually anymore. And soon people began to look on the instruments and thought, hang on, there's blips coming towards us. Oh my God, we're under attack. And they could see a fleet coming towards them and didn't know what to do. So the Americans decided just to open fire into the fog and started blasting away. And then they realized there wasn't really anything there. Because in certain weather conditions like this, you can sometimes get a bounce back on the instruments from your own fleet. They were seeing effectively a reflection of themselves. That wasn't unheard of. So they then radioed back to the White House and said, sorry about that. It was all a big false alarm. But that is not what the world was told the next day. Oh, no. Instead, Lyndon Johnson, often the target of many conspiracy theories, gives a big speech saying that America had been attacked and that there was indeed no choice but to get into a massive conflict. And off the back of that basic lie came all the horror and misery that followed later on. And then as the years go by, as you might imagine, intelligence reports come out and it turns out, oh yeah, it never happened, did it? Oh, well, don't worry. And one phrase that's very apt in this case that you'll often hear is, well, it all got lost in the fog of war. The fog of war. Well, yes, well, for that fog of war, an awful lot of people died in very horrible ways. And the fact that we know that it didn't happen, and yet the world's never officially acknowledged that properly, what does that tell you? Again, it's the dangerous shrug. Oh, well, it was a long time ago, wasn't it? Don't need to worry about that. But it means they can keep doing it. And that's the problem. And how often is this happening now? Right, some conspiracy theories seem so mainstream that it's almost not worth talking about, but sometimes they are. And speaking of questionable presidents, we better mention this one. Richard Nixon, as most of you know, was forced to resign in the early 1970s over the Watergate scandal. Now, this is something that on the surface looks like not much, a kind of a political espionage scandal. But it's what's under the surface where it gets a little bit more interesting. So cutting a longer story short, Nixon was accused of ordering a burglary here at the Watergate office complex. That is why the word gate always now gets applied to any conspiracy. So in the 70s, this used to house the Democratic National Committee headquarters. One night, a group of Republican burglars were found inside, and nobody's ever fully said what they were up to. But anyway, some kind of skullduggery on behalf, clearly, of the Republicans. Nixon was initially accused of ordering this burglary. That was never proved. But it was proved it had occurred and he had known about the burglary and then tried to cover it up. Now, that's what did for Nixon. And being a very paranoid man, he's not the only president that's done this, but he'd put recording equipment all around the White House. And what people didn't know was that every conversation was being recorded. And of course, then when the Watergate scandal broke and knowledge of these tapes went public, the court sequestered the tapes and demanded to hear everybody's voices on it. So suddenly, Nixon was in trouble, except it could have been a lot worse. Because would you believe it? Just before the courts received the tapes, his secretary, Rosemary Woods, accidentally erased the 18 most important minutes. Well, you probably wouldn't believe it, but they were gone. And once they were gone, they're gone. And it was never proved that Nixon had been a deliberate part of the burglary, though he probably was. But there was a fragment there making it clear he'd covered it up. But other people wonder what other things would we have heard on those tapes. And it's worth looking that up, because from what we can tell, it would have been absolute dynamite. Now, nonetheless, it's bad enough for Nixon. He's forced to resign. But then he's pardoned by Gerald Ford, who comes in after him. And in American law, if you get pardoned, all investigation into the scandal that unseated you ends. So we never really got to the bottom of Watergate, not properly. But hang on a minute, the burglars were still alive, weren't they? Everyone forgets this. When they did their time and then came out, two of them went on record. Right, E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis both had CIA connections. Sturgis had mafia connections. They said the reason that they were ordered into Watergate was to retrieve incriminating photographs stored there that would have implicated Nixon in, and certainly the CIA in, the assassination of, can you guess? JFK. That's really interesting, because that then means Watergate was actually about much more, that it was an attempt to cover up what happened at Dealey Plaza in 1963 when Kennedy was shot dead. Now, we're not going to go into the fine detail of this, but you know the story here. This kind of matters because whether you like Kennedy or don't like him, he was clearly taken out in a very dubious way, and we still live with the repercussions of that in the world today. And I'm not saying he was all good, because he certainly wasn't. But nonetheless, the fact that the state or somebody got away with this, it hasn't helped us. So at the time, as you know, it was all blamed on one man, Lee Oswald. I know we all call him Lee Harvey Oswald, but he never used his middle name. So I'm not quite sure why they say that. But anyway, let's call him Lee Oswald. In the few hours we had to hear from him when he was apprehended, he claimed he was a patsy and that he was a setup and that there was a much bigger story going on. Now, some still argue as to whether he fired any of the bullets. The official version says that he fired all of them. Some say some. But the problem was when the Warren Commission, which very unsatisfactorily then investigated the assassination, it had to explain how so few bullets had done so much damage. And if you've ever seen the courtroom scene in the Kevin Costner film JFK, it's worth seeing just for that scene alone, where he makes the magic bullet seem just so utterly ridiculous. And here you can see the diagram. We're told one bullet did an awful lot of damage. Most ballistics experts say that was not possible with the gun that Oswald was using, the angle, the moving target. And by the way, the gun that they display today at the museum is not the gun that he actually had. There's a lot of evidence that that gun got switched. So the problem is, if, and the general majority of people go down this road, if you say Oswald did not fire all the bullets, somebody else was also firing bullets. Yeah, this is the old hoary conspiracy theory around this. But that does matter, because then you've got to stop and say, well, who was firing it? That, therefore, is a wider conspiracy. It's not just a lone fanatic. If you go online, you're going to find loads of diagrams showing you where other shooters might have been. And it's worth looking it up. Did a security guard's pistol accidentally go off during this? Did the driver shoot Ken? I mean, right, we could be here all day, right? Make your own mind up. But the point is, it's absolutely clear we've not been told the truth. And one of the lies that has been told in the years since is that it's only a modern conspiracy theory that other gunmen were present. That is completely ridiculous, right? You can find minutes of speeches made, literally days after the shooting, where everybody's talking about the other gunmen. This was a normal conversation, but then they managed to bury that and then brand it conspiracy theory if you started to talk about other gunmen. And very much to do with Kennedy comes that campaign against conspiracy theory, and some believe that they, encourage that phrase ever after. Because if it's only a theory, well, it can't be true. Well, that's not true, is it? I mean, look at, dark energy theory. They're happy to treat that as real, aren't they? So, listen, there's nothing wrong really with the phrase conspiracy theory if you use it in its true context. Anyway, here's the point. The evidence for other gunmen is very strong. Here we see the grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza. Many people here claimed they heard shots coming from over that wall in the middle. And that, curiously, is where the Watergate photographs, apparently, would have shown CIA men standing looking very dubious. So there's much more to this. We haven't got the time. But the point that I want to make to you today is this, that of course then Oswald himself in this horrible moment here was shot dead by a man called Jack Ruby, who walks out of the crowd and guns him down at point blank range. Now Ruby is often promoted as a man who did this as great revenge for the American people. But it's absolutely clear that he and Oswald knew each other very well. Some even claim they were lovers. But what's interesting is Ruby had obviously been told, look, if you do this, right, you'll be very rich and famous. You do a little bit of time and then they'll let you out and it'll all be fine. When he realised that was unlikely to happen, he started to make comments that I don't think they expected. He gave a press conference from his cell. Look it up. You can hear the audio online, right? And he then starts to make these very damning insinuations that there is a wider plot, or was, to get rid of Kennedy, and he knew who was involved. And he was threatening to say more when he was found dead in the police cells. Now, look, he wasn't a well man, that's true, but he said every day doctors come in and they inject me, and I don't know why, and I think they're trying to kill me, and sure enough, he didn't live long enough to say any more. But we shouldn't forget that other people knew Ruby and Oswald. One of them was a lady called Rose Cherami. She worked in one of Ruby's rather sleazy nightclubs, but she claimed she was present one night in a room with Ruby and Oswald together, surrounded by men she believed to be CIA, discussing the shooting of Kennedy that would take place a few days after this. She informed the police of what she'd heard and wasn't believed. And yeah, she was a druggie and all of that, so they said, get out of here. But sadly, she wasn't believed. And then, of course, when the shooting did take place, well, she was in a compromised position, which might then explain why she was then found dead lying by the side of the road. A bit like 9/11 witnesses, many Kennedy witnesses died mysteriously early, and some of the people around the grassy knoll, and that's worth looking up what happened to them. Above statistical chance, it was almost like witnesses were slowly or quickly being got rid of. So you're then left thinking, well, maybe the lone gunman theory is still the official theory, but of course it isn't. Because in 1979, right, this paper here reinvestigated and came up with the conclusion that actually there was a high probability that there were other gunmen. But I was just left hanging. They didn't have the power to take that any further. So actually, the official view is, yeah, there probably were other gunmen, but hey, don't worry about it. Shrug. Everyone shrug again. Back to sleep, everyone. Ooh, worrying. And you're then left having to guess who gave the orders. Well, here's the usual list, right? Cuban exiles, Fidel Castro, the mafia, the Soviets, the bankers, the Israelis, the Freemasons, Black Ops military, or even MJ-12, the secret UFO investigation team. I talk very briefly about UFOs in a second. Looking back today, the general view is the New World Order had to get rid of Kennedy. He was speaking out against secret societies very publicly. He wanted to reform the Federal Reserve. You remember that? That didn't go down well. It upset the mafia. He was saying that the Soviets and the Americas should work together, get this, and this is true, in exchanging space technology and UFO information. Isn't that interesting? So maybe people were queuing up to get rid of him because that wasn't what they wanted to go public. And then, of course, there was old Marilyn Monroe episodes, and many people believe she was murdered. On the subject of UFOs, I covered this last time here, so I'm not going to go into it today. I do think, though, that what's just happened at the US congressional hearings on UFOs is amazing. Now, I know many people think this is a setup, and it might be that this is a distraction from what's really going on. But nonetheless, it is historical that we had two pilots and an ex-intelligence officer, David Grush, there, actually testify to proper representatives that UFOs are real. Grush says that they do have bodies and they do have craft, all the usual old conspiracy things that many people have long believed. And as we know, they've been releasing their own footage. It's worth watching the whole 2.5 hours. Helen and I watched the whole 2.5 hours of it, and it is utterly riveting. Because whether you think they're lying or telling the truth, one thing you cannot escape, right? If these are alien, the world has changed, as many believe. If it is Black Ops military that some other power's got, or even they've got, and they're just trying to pretend they haven't, the world has still changed. There is technology now doing unbelievable things that challenge all laws of physics. It changes everything, the economy, everything. Go and look it up and think about this, because either way, they've shot themselves in the foot now, because it's going to be very hard to undo this. Some are trying to say Grush is a liar and he's a cheat, blah, 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 blah. But it's hard to really keep saying all these pilots that are talking about this are just making it up. So something's flying around that challenges everything that we have believed about physics up to today. And that's massive. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Right, briefly, back to Kennedy. Somebody else that often gets blamed is, of course, Lyndon Johnson. His mistress, after Johnson died, said that he had told her specifically that he was part of the plot to kill Kennedy. And of course, there's the whole Jim Garrison sort of theories and local businessmen who wanted to get rid of him. You make your own minds up, but one thing is clear, we've not been officially told the truth of JFK, and it does matter. Because that is so often used to say, oh, that's what got everybody believing in conspiracy theories, and they were all mad then. They weren't mad then, and it's clear this is still not resolved, and they're not all mad today. But of course, it didn't end there. Kennedy, of course, had a brother. So Bobby Kennedy then gets shot dead in 1968, shortly after announcing he was going to run for president. The same year, Martin Luther King goes down. It begins to look like anybody that tries to rock the boat or sticks their head above the parapet, they're not going to last long. And what that does is create an atmosphere of paranoia in which, of course, conspiracy theories are going to be guaranteed to thrive. And so, especially after Watergate and with the Vietnam War raging, people stopped believing what they were told, and especially in America. And that will soon come here too, of course. And what was one of the big things that America had done, which they said was a fantastic balance to all the darkness and horror? It was go to the moon. Oh, yes. Now, I know you're going to hear some things about the moon tomorrow. What is so fascinating, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, is how many people just laugh at this. And yet you look at the polls, and I think one poll in Britain from about 3 years ago said that now over 50% of British people don't believe we went to the moon. That is absolutely astonishing. And then in the next breath, they'll say that conspiracy theorists are a fringe minority. Well, clearly not. Isn't that fascinating? But many people never stop to look at the evidence. So I'm just going to just remind ourselves of just some of the key reasons why people question it. Now, I'm not here to tell you exactly whether we did go to the moon or not, because I wasn't there, but I am going to just remind ourselves of why it is valid to question the evidence, right? So look, we got 3 bits of evidence. We went to the moon, you got the astronauts and their testimony. What if they're lying? What if they were mind controlled to say it? What if they were forced to say it and their families were threatened? You can't be sure. The astronauts, by the way, contradict each other hugely. And that is really interesting. By the way, look at the Apollo 11 press conference when they've just come down from the moon. They look like the most depressed people you've ever seen. They don't look like they're going, wow, we were on the moon. It's like they've been told to front something they are really not happy to front. Look it up. It's really quite shocking to watch it. Okay. What else have we got? Moon rock. That could have been brought back by automated probes, of course. That doesn't prove that people stood on the moon. And then what else have we got? Oh, well, the photographs and the videos. But especially the high-res photographs are used as the main evidence we went to the moon. And that's where it all starts to get very difficult. So many of you know this. I'm going to skip through this a bit. However, so people will look at a picture like that and say, well, look at the mountains in the distance. They're out of focus. They shouldn't be at that focal length. And many photographers have said, yeah, that is weird. They should be crystal clear. There's no atmosphere on the moon. There's no dust hanging in the air. Why aren't they clear? And hang on a minute, is that a scenery drawing? And then the flags seem to flap in some of the videos for no very good reason. That shouldn't happen in a vacuum. And of course, people were already noticing this in the 1970s and began to wonder if maybe they hadn't really gone to the moon. It's really worth noting that they've been remastering the moon images in the last few years. Remastering, well, many would say completely fiddling them. And some of what they are doing to restore these photographs is actually quite shocking, and you just have to wonder, really, that it's almost like they don't want you to look at the original photographs anymore. They want you to look at the new ones, which, would you believe, correct some of the images. I even use that word, to correct them. Correct them from what? So let's look at the original images. Classic. Buzz Aldrin on the moon. You've got sunlight coming from behind, apparently. Jet black shadow there. But he's quite well lit up. And some say, shouldn't he be in silhouette? NASA says no. They say what's happening is light's reflecting off the surface, filling in the detail on the suit and so on. But if there's that much reflected light, why don't we see detail in the shadow on the ground? And there's many other images like that, where they say there's a lot of reflected light, but then there's massive pools of shadow on the ground where there's no reflected light, even when things are standing there that should reflect light there. So there's many questions about that, and angles of shadows and all of that. And then you realise there's a bright pool of light just behind him. And if we go to a contrasted version of that, I know it's very light in here, but you're getting the idea. You can see that he's standing in a bright pool of light that is falling off into shadow. Even in the normal photograph, it's falling off into shadow there on the horizon, and shadow even a few feet in the foreground. So that does get some people saying, well, that must be lighting. That's artificial lighting. And there's a lot of images that do show these bright spots. And of course, they say they didn't use artificial lighting. So how do we explain these anomalies? And once you set off down this road, of course, then you begin to question everything. And that's exactly what's happened. And that's why we're in the place today where we are, where nobody really believes a lot of it. You then look at the helmet. There's Armstrong taking the picture, being reflected. Taking the picture with the camera strapped to his chest, standing on flat ground, which means it's almost impossible to believe that Armstrong took this photograph. Because if he did at that level, you can easily calculate that's where the horizon ought to be there, not up there going neatly through the helmet. And there's a lot of images like this where when you look at them, these angles are not possible. There's the cameras. There's another horizon anomaly. The astronaut did not take that picture. It's just so easy to prove that, right? Another shadow anomaly and all the rest of it. You can see here that the cameras were strapped to the chest. So there was no viewfinders. They were walking around going click, click, and just hoping they'd get masterpieces. Funnily enough, they did, mostly, using gardening gloves, pressurized. So then you start to question the whole image side of it. I mean, they were good cameras. They were Hasselblad. Ask Marcus Allen for more. What they didn't have, though, was any real radiation protection. Some think that that's one of the problems. There's a halfway theory here, which says we did go to the moon, but it could never make the pictures come out. Because if you remember long ago, if you ever came back from your holidays with a film in a canister, right, when they got to the airport scanner, people would often tell you not to put the film through the scanner, because, of course, the X-rays would fog it. Well, on the moon, it is awash with X-rays and other high-level radiation and all the rest of it. So maybe they did get to the moon, some argue, and it could never make the pictures come out. Had to show the Soviets something and then had to restage some or all of them later. Others say the Soviets were all part of the same game. I mean, we can go on forever like this. But whichever way you look at it, radiation's a problem. And some have wondered how the astronauts survived the layers of radiation that they were put through to get to the moon and back without any particularly high level of cancer. And that's something which has, I think, confounded a lot of people. Here's another image of the lunar lander. There's the sun, apparently, jet black shadow, but so much light in what ought to be the silhouette side. The astronaut's glowing. And these arrows here very helpfully pointing out the sunlight's not bouncing off the ground, it's coming directly in from the side. Go online and look at the high-res shots. You can zoom right in, and you can see there's clearly a light source over there. It's not Earth light, by the way, Earth's up here somewhere. So, there are anomalies that have never been adequately explained. And that's why people question. And here's another thing. When you look under... No, actually, let me just briefly go back there. When you look underneath the craft, ignore the sack, what you never see in the still images is any disturbance of dust on the ground. Now watch the videos of the landers coming down. There's an enormous ejecta comes up from the ground, but in the still images there's literally no disturbance at all. Now let's look at this. That's Mars, where the first Mars rover got lowered down some years ago by a platform hovering 70 feet up. And even 70 feet up, the jets notably scalded the ground. And did you see the more recent rover? It's worth a look at the shots underneath it. And this never touched ground. This was a long way up, right? That's the markings, or those are the markings that were left underneath it. On the moon, nothing. On the moon, not even any dust has blown onto the feet of the craft. It's like they came out vacuumed. Oh, my God. And you compare that to another Mars lander, the Phoenix lander, showing what you'd expect, dirt and dust on the foot, right? We don't see anything like this on the moon. And then you look at the lunar landers taking off and the automatic camera follows them up. You see the explosive bolts go off. What don't you see? There's no glow. There's no evidence of thrust. That is going up on several £1,000s worth of thrust. There's no visual evidence for that. And there should be. Right? This is what NASA thought it should look like. Yes, even in a vacuum. That is pre-mission artwork, bright and visible. And only a few years later, the space shuttle used exactly the same fuel mix. And when that fired its thrusters in a vacuum, look, it was bright and visible. And that is what you should see there. And you see nothing. And of course, then critics say, well, no, because it's going up on a wire, isn't it? Because it's a model. Then you get into the whole Stanley Kubrick arguments, all of that. My personal view is he didn't fake them, but it's certainly possible the techniques that he used for his film 2001 almost certainly were probably appropriated. Let's put it like that. And then you realise NASA has faked some images, because some people will say, well, they would never do that, would they? And then you just see classics like this. This is the late Michael Collins spacewalking from one of the Gemini craft in the 60s, or at least we did think that. Until a few years later, somebody was going through the NASA image bank and found this picture of Collins in a test aeroplane. And they've literally cut round him and stuck him on black. And there's at least 2 other collaged photographs you can prove are cut and pastes because they foolishly never hit the original source material. That's how dumb they were. I don't think they ever thought anybody would question it. That's the issue. Others, of course, argue, oh, it was a whistleblowing thing. They deliberately left these mistakes so that one day the truth would out. What we should note, though, is that it wasn't just conspiracy thinkers who were questioning the moon landings. Some of the astronauts were big critics too. This gentleman here is Virgil Grissom, or Gus Grissom as he was known. He should have been first man on the moon, but he never thought they were going to get there. You can listen to some of the press conferences, and he's saying, I think the chances of us getting to the moon and back are slim. And he started to annoy people within NASA. And he started to get death threats by phone until he got to the point where he said to his wife one day, if there is ever a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me, because they're basically telling me to shut up. Well, strange it was then that shortly after saying that, and tragic it was, the whole crew here died in the Apollo 1 fire. They weren't even going anywhere. It was just a launch pad test in a very ill-advisedly oxygen-rich atmosphere. Now, that's a really silly thing to do, because in an oxygen atmosphere, you only need 1 spark, and it's good night, Vienna. And that's what happened here. And they said it was a terrible accident, and it was an awful accident, and let's all forget about it now. And what was interesting was, was it an accident? Because the Grissom family, some years later, said it wasn't. Scott Grissom was Grissom's son. Years later, he'd become a qualified aerospace engineer. He was granted access to the capsule in which his father died, and he discovered a small metal plate had been inserted into that dashboard, the only function of which could have been to have caused a spark. And remember, 1 spark's all you need, and you go bang. So, no, the Grissom family say it's sabotage. Even the NASA safety inspector at the time brought in to investigate not only the fire, but also the whole technical feasibility of Apollo, Thomas Ronald Barron, immediately concluded it was sabotage. You can read his very damning report online, 500 pages. Well, you could, unless they've taken it off yet. He was writing an even longer report when he was killed in a mysterious car crash. Now, that's not evidence of anything, but, it made people think anybody else within NASA might stay quiet if you're going to cause a fuss. Now, look, we should say here, nobody argues the whole of NASA was involved in a conspiracy. That would be stupid, right? Rockets took off, capsules came down, we all saw this. Where they went in between and where the signals came from and then the detail in between, that's another story. There are certainly massive unanswered questions. And look, here's the thing. I'm not going through all these. Go and look it up if you haven't already. Look up especially allis.com if you want to get to the real roots of this, right? There are so many unanswered questions that, of course, people will question that we went to the moon. Now they're saying they're going back, right? The Artemis probe apparently is going to go back in the next couple of years. Well, let's see if that happens. Because they keep saying, but we've got to make sure it's safe. Well, they were doing it in tin boxes 60 years ago, 50 years ago. It's funny how it was so easy then, but not so easy now. So let's see where that goes, shall we? Right, we need to move on. Right, strange deaths, therefore, as we've seen, will always lead to conspiracy theories. And this is particularly opposite today, I think we briefly better mention this lady here. Because another theory that gets widely laughed at now, not for a while, but now, is that Princess Diana was murdered in a staged car crash. And for a time, a lot of people thought that. So we've seen today the death of Mohammed al-Fayed. And of course, he was a big proponent of that theory that somehow the Secret Services had got rid of her. And then the inquest said something very different. One interesting thing, so another history that's been rewritten. The interview she gave, right, with Martin Bashir and all of that, they're telling you now it was because of Bashir fiddling a few things to get her to do the interview, which I'm sure he did, right? Because of that, that's what made her believe there was a plot to get rid of her. No, it wasn't. There's a lot of evidence she already believed that. And don't forget, her bodyguard, Barry Manicky, right? He had been killed in a motorbike crash some years earlier, and she absolutely believed that he was murdered. So she was already of that mind. So be careful what road they're leading you down here. She was always suspicious that somebody might try and get her. Anyway, she did the interview. She talked about the dark forces running the country, and maybe that wasn't such a wise thing. And of course, then when the crash occurred in 97, a lot of people in their gut did think, ooh, blimey, have they got rid of her in some way? That isn't what the inquest says. The inquest blames the driver, Henri Paul. He was so drunk, apparently, he couldn't control the car, and all the paparazzi were chasing it and lost control, and that's it, really. Except that they even have openly admitted the blood sample that apparently proved, right, that he was drunk was not his blood. They've accepted that. They then said they took eye gel, and that proved that he was drunk. But if you believe the toxicology reports that they say show he was deadly drunk, well, he shouldn't have been able to have got out of bed that afternoon because he was a night worker, right? Let alone drive a car and look normal. He looks normal on the CCTV. Most people say he just seemed completely normal. He certainly wasn't drunk. And it all hangs on this. But should it? Unanswered questions, the story of the white Fiat. Well, I mean, we know a white Fiat was involved with the crash because it left its paint on the Mercedes and then sped off. Now, some have argued that's what drove the Mercedes into the side of the tunnel. The experts say no, because it wasn't in the right place and the crash had already begun before that happened. All right. But you still want to talk to the driver, yeah? You want to talk to the driver of that white Fiat and find out. Because there was tales of a weird bright flash. Some say they were basically, making the driver so distracted that he was going to crash. So this is an old CIA technique. It's not unknown. And then the French authorities couldn't trace the Fiat because, would you believe it? For the only time in modern history, the CCTV in that part of Paris was off that night. Oh. Well, Mohammed al-Fayed, who was a bit of a curious bloke, but listen, his son Doonie, who just died in this crash, so it was fair enough, said, I'm not having that. So he hired private detectives, and they very quickly tracked down a man called James Andanson, there with his wife and his white Fiat. And Andanson, as you might imagine, said it wasn't me. But strange it was that shortly after being exposed, he was found dead in another car. He'd been shot in the head, and then an attempted decapitation, just for good measure. The keys of the car then been thrown into a nearby field and the car set light to. And the French authorities said this was suicide. This is what we're asked to believe. And most people went, oh, okay. That's how incurious our journalists are. They didn't go, oh, hang on a minute. But anyway, let's carry on. We should note that Diana told her butler, Paul Burrell, there was a plot to kill her. Now, Burrell is a bit of an odd bloke, but there's no doubting. There's no doubting that she did tell him that. She also said the same to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon. So it's long on record that she believed they were out to get her. And of course, we have her letters. And the letters are authenticated. Here's a really damning one, where she writes, my husband is planning an accident in my car. Serious head injury, brake failure. In order to make the path clear for him to marry her, Tiggy, not Camilla. Because she then adds, Camilla is nothing but a decoy. So who is she talking about? So she's talking here about Tiggy Leg Burke, who was nanny to William and Harry. And it was Diana's belief that Charles and Tiggy were having an affair. Really, it was Tiggy that Charles wanted to marry. What everybody forgets, though, and I find this really extraordinary, and it's been virtually wiped from newspaper history, is that shortly before Diana had her crash, Camilla had a weird crash. She was run off the side of country lanes near her home. Somebody basically forced her into a ditch, and she managed to scramble out, and she fled across the fields. And when the police said, "Why did you do that?" she said, "Well, I thought somebody might be trying to kill me." Right, try and find a reference to this now and you'll struggle. It's in the newspaper archives, but nobody talks about this. What if somebody did try to kill Camilla, to take somebody out this horrible quadrangle, and having failed thought, we can't try again, it's going to look way too obvious. I know, let's get rid of Diana. People are queuing up to get rid of Diana by now, a bit like JFK. She was very successfully campaigning against landmines, for instance, and yet she's going out with Dodi Al-Fayed, whose mother is Samira Khashoggi of the Khashoggi arms dealing family. Maybe they didn't want a peacenik at the dinner table. Mohammed Al-Fayed said maybe she was pregnant with Dodi's baby and the royal family didn't want a Muslim bloodline. He blamed the late Duke of Edinburgh and so on. I always advocate at this stage asking a different question to the obvious one, right? Because it's one of these things that's not entirely easy to resolve. But rather than saying, was Diana murdered in a staged car crash, pop that aside and ask, are there strange things in connection with Diana's death? And the answer really has to be yes, whatever that means in your eyes. But you're not supposed to do that, or you're a mad conspiracy theorist. And something else that really hasn't had the coverage it deserves. This is the hospital in Paris where Diana was taken into after the crash, and she was badly injured but expected to survive. She was made comfortable by the French staff, and then the English staff turned up. Well, thanks, chaps. Well, you've done a grand job, right? There we go. Right, we'll carry on now, and escorted all the French from the room, excuse me. And then, just a short while later, they came out and said, "Oh, she's died." And the French doctors couldn't believe this. One of the doctors was going to write a book about what he witnessed that night because he thought it was suspicious. Can you guess what happened to him? Yeah, he was killed in a strange car crash shortly afterward. That's funny, isn't it? It's not proof of anything, I accept, but you begin to understand there's a pattern here. And if you want to add in Dr. David Kelly as well, you can. Because in most polls, the majority of British people, a bit like the moon landings, right? Not just conspiracy thinkers, normal British people believe Diana was murdered. No matter what the inquests say, in our gut, we go, there's something wrong here. And the gut can often be meaningful. Might not give you all the answers, but it's interesting, isn't it? But then, of course, when you get mass deaths, well, the conspiracies get even bigger. You don't need me to say much about this. I'm going to rush through this. Needless to say, 9/11 is, in my view, one of the most obvious and provable conspiracies that ever was. And I don't just mean the bin Laden conspiracy. Bin Laden may well have been involved. You've got to have patsies, a bit like the gunpowder plot. You've got to have people you can, blame credibly. But it is absolutely clear they have lied through their teeth about the detail. They have edited air traffic control. You name it. You people know this, so I don't really need to explain this. There are so many anomalies. The plane that hit the Pentagon has a wingspan of 124 feet, but gets into a hole no more than 20 feet across at the main entry point. That's amazing. And then when a lot of people did query that, and I do mean sensible people and architects and that, and they said, well, what happened to the wings then? They thought about it for a while and they came back in the end with, the wings vaporized. Wow, that's the first vaporizing aeroplane in the whole of history. That's amazing. And then it goes on. The very trajectory we are told it took to hit the Pentagon, instead of heading for this amazing bullseye and taking out half the block. Oh, no. No, it drops 5,000 feet in less than 2 minutes at apparently 500 miles per hour, which many pilots and personal pilots I've spoken to, by the way, have said, that ain't possible without breaking the plane up in the air. But anyway, it did this apparently and took this turn to hit the one block of the Pentagon that was under renovation at that time. Didn't have so many people in it. It's like restricted carnage was only required there, different to the World Trade Center. And the man doing this, well, Hani Hanjour, An Al-Qaeda terrorist who even the flight school that inadvertently trained him up, say, could not handle a light aircraft. But on 9/11, we're told to believe he did this incredible feat of aviation acrobatics. And you're meant to go with that. And because most people never investigate, of course they do. We could go on, you know about all this. You've got the Twin Towers. They contravene the laws of physics and the way to come down in so many ways. Just go and look it up. You probably know this. And then you see things like some say, well, that's molten metal rolling down the towers before they collapse. Well, even if you accept the official temperatures, nothing should have melted steel to that degree unless something had been already pre-placed into the building to do it. And there are demolition techniques that can make things burn hotter. And you know this. There's enormous visual and indeed eyewitness evidence of explosions going off in those towers even before the collapses began. But even when you see the footage, don't look up there. That's coming down at effectively free-fall speed. Look below. These are independent explosions that look ever so like demolition techniques. Now, whether you go down the Dr. Judy Wood theories or whether you go down the more conventional theories, either way, this is not a natural collapse, right? And then all of that is just thrown into relief by the building that we have all heard of, I'm sure, but most people out there have not. Building number 7 is the biggest anomaly of 9/11. Most people never heard of it. And just in case you are not familiar with it, it was a couple of blocks away from the Twin Towers. After all the carnage of them coming down, it was evacuated, nobody was in it. But weirdly, a few hours later, it suddenly decided to do this, which is, of course, very peculiar for a 47-story steel frame building to do, that was never hit by an aeroplane. And even more interestingly, the BBC announced its collapse 20 minutes before it occurred. So in other words, a press release had already been prepared. I don't blame the journalist. She was just reading any old thing out. It had been prepared knowing it would come down. Well, nobody thought that building would come down. Why would it come down? And in the end, it took 8 years for the National Institute of Standards and Technology to say, what brought this down was fire. Terrible fire. Well, all right, let's have a quick look. So here we see, you can just about get the idea in here. Look, even if we accept the claim there was a lot more fire inside than we can see from the outside, the whole report just makes no sense. They make claims about the way shear studs break away from concrete that are untrue. They basically make it up and just say, and every single support collapsed at exactly the same moment, floor by floor. And there's the answer. And so many people have said that's just not possible. Go and look it up. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is as good a starting point as any. So we're back to the same point, but there's just so many unanswered questions. You can laugh at some conspiracy theories, but some are just so overt. You cannot believe that this has not been reinvestigated. And they're hoping desperately now that it's getting old enough that, a bit like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we'll all forget about it and it'll all be over. And we won't have to think about these things anymore. Whereas meanwhile, every time an atrocity like that happens, as you all know, it puts us into fear, and we are controlled by fear. This is such an obvious technique, and you all know it, and that's why you're here. So I don't need to say much here. 9/11 was the perfect opportunity for the New World Order, as Pearl Harbor had been before it. And they didn't call it the new Pearl Harbor for nothing. And then in the wake of all the other terror attacks we've had, if you believe in them or not, they then start talking about microchipping the population. And that would be lovely, because the world would be safe then. And it won't be criminals. And you couldn't possibly get past that system. But of course, it also gives enormous power to, let's say, a dodgy regime. No, let's rephrase that. An even dodgier regime comes to power. They've got a lot of power over you, haven't they? Once we're all on a network where you can only go shopping or get on a bus when you've got this chip in your arm, and they don't like your political views, or they say he's a conspiracy theorist, and they delete you off the system, great. You can't go anywhere anymore. Can't do anything anymore. Can't go shopping, can't buy food. It's where it was heading towards the end of the pandemic, wasn't it? If you hadn't gone down the orthodox route. It would be so easy to do. And they always justify it when we are afraid. And that's where we have to be so careful. And it's even been in the mainstream press. Because often I'll say that to normal people. And they go, no, come on, they wouldn't do that. And you show them the cuttings. This is mainstream. And they go, oh, all right. But people then just hope it never happens. And the world moves on. So, a phrase that we're all fond of using, and I've used it today, is they. We've got to start to pull this together. I know we've got to end soon. Right. They are doing this to us. And they are. But who are the they? It's actually really easy to identify. I mean, read David Icke's books. He names a lot of them. But let's just look at a couple of good examples. So the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, if he's new to you, do look him up. It's a very good example of somebody that was part of the they. An absolute New World Order advocate, unashamedly. Do read his book, The Grand Chessboard. You can buy it on Amazon, so it's all in the mainstream, right? He basically puts forward some very draconian policies as to how the world should be run, basically by Western American hegemony, okay? And he justifies it and says, and this is a good thing. And he was a main power in the world for a while. He was one of the sponsors of the whole Obama years. This man was a powerful man. And I'm going to tell you one of the things that he advocates in his book in a moment. And meanwhile, on the subject of they, of course, you've got the different organizations, and some people will list them all in a big pyramid online, you know, that are behind all this totalitarianism, like the Bilderbergs and the Trilateral Commission. Most of you know this. But if you don't know it, go and look them up. These are unelected quangos. They have enormous power over parliaments around the world. And I know it can be a bit of a corny thing for us to, oh yeah, the Bilderbergs. Most people do not know these people exist and do not realize the power they have over them. And you'll see listed at the bottom there, the World Economic Forum, led by Mr. Klaus Schwab. And that's mainstream. That's something is in the news often. And you try to say to new people, have you actually looked up what they're kind of gunning for here and the amount of power they've had? And if you want to add the World Health Organization into that, please do. And the whole Great Reset thing, where they're all asking us to give up our lifestyles for a more collective, more communal lifestyle, where we'll all be happy and we won't own anything, but everything will be lovely. Is he not going to not own anything? Is he going to give up everything? I wonder. And then people say, oh, they wouldn't do that. I often hear this. They wouldn't do that. And this, I've never heard of this man. He's not influential. And then you then show them a picture like that. And you go, yes, he is. You've just not heard of him because the mainstream press doesn't want to talk about him too much. And of course, that's how the world gets hypnotized. We know this. I'm preaching to the converted here. The power games, the control agendas, they are there. We know this. The problem that we have, and it's already been acknowledged today, is getting this out further. Because we can all gather in lovely places like this and talk till the cows come home about it. But if it doesn't go out there in a way that other people can understand, it won't serve. And this is why we need to get informed and galvanize ourselves. And then you tell people about the Bohemian Club. And you tell them their world leaders are gathering in front of a giant stone owl and worshipping it wearing weird robes. And they laugh. And they say they wouldn't do that. And you go, they are doing it. It's been exposed even by mainstream journalists like John Ronson. And look, it's very deeply occult. And in the next breath, they'll say, oh, these wicked conspiracy theories about satanic plots and paedophilia. And then they sacrifice the effigy of a child to the owl. Not a real child, but, it's making the point. And then they wonder why people come up with conspiracy theories. They don't help themselves, do they? And it's right that it should be scrutinized. And it's so well known. This is what's extraordinary to me, right? People even know when the Bohemian Grove ceremony is going on and they protest outside. Does the mainstream media report this? No. Because the mainstream media and the powers that be are just two sides of the same coin. They'll expose each other to a degree here and there, but then they stop because they know that there is a level where you have to stop if they know what's good for them. And when you do that, what do you do? Does that end conspiracy theories when you ignore people like this? Does that end them? No. It means they literally go stratospheric. And so people go, well, they're lying about that and worshipping owls. Why should I believe anything? And next thing you know, people are saying, what if they were going to try and poison us? They know we're onto them. So they're going to suppress us now by pouring more things into the atmosphere. And either it's there to kill us or suppress us or, I don't know, some climate control. And then people get condemned for thinking that, right? But you think, yeah, but hang on, why shouldn't we worry about that when they're doing all these other things? And then you hear about the HARP project, where all these bases have gone up over the world. And allegedly it's military communication, but you look at the science, if they beamed it at us in certain ways, it wouldn't do us any good. And some believe it's there for mind control. Now, when you say that, people say, oh, that's just paranoia. Right, and you say, right, would you like to read Brzezinski's book? Right, go onto Amazon, order the Grand Chessboard. And in the Grand Chessboard, he actually says, what we need is a ring of satellites going around the world, beaming down rays that interfere with human brainwaves to keep the population docile so we control them for their own good. He says that. This man was running the world for a number of years. That's the mindset. They think that's okay. But most people don't believe that anybody in power would think like that. Well, they do. And if we try and point it out, we're terrible people. And of course, that meant that when we got to this, funnily enough, a lot of people didn't believe what they were told. So look, whether you half believe it, don't believe any of it, whatever, it was not fair to say to people that we should suddenly trust these people in a crisis when they've never shown themselves to be honest ever before, but now we had to trust them. And what I found extraordinary was when people then, of course, objected to the jab, and then even Andrew Bridgen MP stood up and said, I'm really concerned about the health effects of the jab. You know all this, right? What happened? Right, this is a representative of Parliament. Whether you like him or think he's a shill or whatever, the fact is he got up and said it, and he was then expelled from the Tory party for doing so. So when he actually spoke out against the orthodoxy, and he used language that maybe could have been better put, but anyway, okay, there we are. Nonetheless, he's one of the few people in Parliament trying to raise alerts to this and to the creeping power of the World Health Organization. But then they stopped him from speaking. And then in the next breath, they say, well, we can't have people saying that. And then they wonder why you got people like Piers Corbyn on the streets with a loud hailer saying the jabs are here to kill you. Well, it's because they don't allow anybody to have a voice. Even people in power cannot question the orthodoxy in these areas. And then, well, funnily enough, it's going to go to the extremes, isn't it? So if you don't want conspiracy theories, stop doing this. And stop showing people like us as mad or dangerous. That is such a twisted version of it. Now, that doesn't mean we're all correct about everything we believe, but we are not wrong to try to see what's going on, and we are not wrong to dare to question the orthodoxy. But now you're either right-wing, and that's the classic thing since QAnon, or you're mad. But the danger is we then polarize back the other way, and this isn't helpful either, where we see the rest of the world as morons, you know, drugged and stupid and that, and with no ability to see the truth. Actually, that's not true either. And I mean, I'm lucky because I give talks to groups like yourselves today. I also get to give talks to very mainstream groups. Now, I have to kind of word it right. You know what I mean. I'm surprised at the amount of people that come up to me and say, oh my God, I've always thought that. I've never heard anyone say it before. They're not stupid. So, all right, some people are stupid, but a lot of people... But a lot of people are not stupid. If we make the assumption they're all dumb, that's a big mistake on our part. You just need to open the door a little bit and you'd be amazed how many people will walk in. We can't force them to believe what we believe all overnight in one go, but we can do something. And by the way, just pointing out real cover-ups and conspiracies that have been exposed. And here's some lightweight ones: Hillsborough, Jimmy Savile, bank scandals, you name it. They are cover-ups. They are things that people try to keep from the public. And if that's just what's going on at the surface, well, what's going on down below? And of course, so now we're in this world where if you talk about it, you'll be penalised, the censorship. So do go and look up my talk on censorship, censored. It's still, I think, just about hanging on YouTube. A lot of mine are coming down now. Great. But hey, it's a sign of strength, I suppose. But my talk about the censorship is really worth looking into, because we all think we know the level of censorship that's going on. It's so easy to miss the little things, and now closing down people's bank accounts seems to be like the next stage, as you've all heard. And then here's the big one, AI. You know, if you go online, go onto YouTube, back to YouTube again, look up the talk I gave a few weeks ago at the Glastonbury Symposium, Artificial Intelligence and Artificial Freedom. because I'm trying now to call attention to the fact that the rise of AI is so massive. If you think it won't affect you, you're wrong. And the orthodoxy that's being programmed into this AI that probably within 20 years is basically going to be doing most things on your behalf is crucial to decide now who programs the orthodoxy and what the orthodoxy is. And you can guess, can't you, that anything we believe is being screened out. And one day, when the computers only know what they've been programmed with, we could easily find ourselves just literally just pushed aside, and we won't even be in the official record. AI is going to make most of us redundant in our own world. So that's problem number one, that's going to overturn the economy, never mind what UFO technology does. But number two, it's going to leave us absolutely at the mercy of the people making the decisions now. So look this up, right? If you can't find it on YouTube, go to my website, truthagenda.org, and just click on the videos page. It's at the top there. And it's an hour-long presentation just revealing just how shocking the power of AI is. Because a lot of us think it won't affect us. We're wrong. So let's pull all this together to close. We've seen today a lot of stuff that you know, but it's really interesting every now and then to look back and put the pieces of history together. And the way I feel about it is, right, even if we don't know the whole picture, I don't want to live in a world where you've got secret forces calling the shots. I want to live in a world where we're allowed to believe what we believe, put it all on the table, shine the light. And the truth will out in the end. Maybe I'm wrong about some things, but I still want the right to, be wrong. I want the right to say, well, I think this is what's going on. Increasingly, that is not the world that we live in. We need to correct this now while we still can. And there is still hope. Hence, we're in the hope community, right? So, do what you're doing here, but remember this, right? When you get outside, the rest of the world doesn't know what we know. And it's being trained by people like Mariana Spring on the BBC to think we're very dangerous, terrible people. That's not really the truth, as we all know. If you want to know more about me and my work, you'll find me on social media. Truthagenda.org is my website. On the table over there are some leaflets. And these two books, if you've not already seen them, Conspiracies and The New Heretics, tell the story that I told today, but with a hell of a lot more detail. New Heretics is the newest one, brings you pretty much up to date with where we are now. And it's an attempt to inform people, and also in a way that gets people to take action without polarizing. And if we can do that, in the end, we'll be much more effective. So I hope that was of some use to you, and thanks for listening. Thank you.